Hello and welcome to a live reading of the first third of The Great Gatsby. Um, this is going to be kind of similar to my previous. Let me just pause it real quick. Turn down the volume. This is going to be similar to my previous reading of Julius Caesar in 3 hours. However, I'm going to be a lot more intelligent this time. Let me just get out my material. So I did the math. And if it took me 3 hours to do the 19,000 word behemoth of Julius Caesar, then theoretically it should take me 7 hours and 10 minutes for The Great Gatsby. Now, obviously, I'm not going to do that. I don't have that kind of time. I don't want to torture myself that much. But I will do a third of it. And hopefully I'll do the second third, and then the third, and it'll be perfect like that. So I'm estimating this live stream to be around 2 hours and 23 minutes. Now, secondly, other than timing, I'm planning on doing this a lot more professionally. Like, I don't expect this to be on any, like, audiobook or anything, but I want this to be less just me making weird accents like last time. So, yeah. If you have any questions, just put in the chat right here, this chat. Let me just test the audio real quick, because I gotta test that. Put in the chat right here, this chat. Let me just test the audio real quick, because I gotta test that. Okay, so that looks good. Time to start reading. So I have the book. I'm not actually sure what this book, what copy name it is. I mean, it says University of Adelaide, but I'm not sure. But okay, so it's in public domain. Yeah, I'm just gonna read this. I'm pretty sure this falls under fair use. So, Chapter 1. In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. He didn't say anymore. Oh, by the way, I have a better microphone this time. I really should have said that earlier. He didn't say anymore, but we've already been unusually communicative in a reserved way, and I understood that he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me, and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores. The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears in a normal person, and so it came about that in college I was unjustly accused of being a politician, because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. Most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently I had feigned sleep, preoccupation, or a hostile levity when I realized by some unmistakable sign that an intimate revelation was quivering on the horizon. For the intimate revelations of a young man, or at least the terms in which they express them, are unusually plagiaristic and marred by obvious suppressions. Reserving judgments is a matter of infinite hope. Oh, that's a hyperbole. I am still a little afraid of missing something if I forget that, as my father snobbishly suggested, and I snobbishly repeat, a sense of the fundamental decencies is parceled out unequally at birth. Okay, so he's talking about how his father, I guess, treated him well, like, disciplined him? I don't know. And after boasting this way of my tolerance, I come to the admission that it has a limit. Conduct may be founded on the hard rock or the wet marshes, but after a certain point, I don't care what it's founded on. When I came back from the East last autumn, I felt that I wanted the world to be in uniform and at a sort of moral tension forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from any reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have unaffected scorn. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him. Some heightened sensibility to the promises of life, as if he was related to one of those intricate machines that register earthquakes 10,000 miles away. This responsiveness had nothing to do with that flabby impressionability which is dignified under the name of the creative temperament. It was an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person, and which it is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gatsby turned out all right at the end. It was what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams, that temporarily closed out of my interests in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. My family have been prominent, well-to-do people in the middle western city for 3 generations. The Carways are something of a clan, and we have a tradition that we're descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch. Apologies to people who actually know how to pronounce that. But the actual founder of my line was my grandfather's brother, who came here in 51, sent a substitute to the Civil War, and started the wholesale hardware business that my father carries on today. I never saw this great uncle, but I'm supposed to look like him, with special reference to the rather hard-boiled painting that hangs in father's office. I graduated from New Haven in 1915, just a quarter of a century after my father, and a little later I participated in that delayed Teutonic migration known as the Great War. I enjoyed the counter-raid so thoroughly that I came back restless. Instead of being the warm century of the world, the Middle West now seemed like the ragged edge of the universe. So I decided to go east and learn the bond business. Everybody I knew was in the bond business, so I suppose it could support one more single man. All my aunts and uncles talked it over as if they were choosing a prep school for me, and finally said, "Why, yes," with very grave, hesitant faces. Father agreed to finance me for a year, and after various delays I came east, permanently. I thought in the spring of 22. The practical thing was to find rooms in the city, but it was a warm season, and I had just left a country of wide lawns and friendly trees. So when a young man at the office suggested that we take a house together in a commuting town, it sounded like a great idea. He found the house, a weather-beaten cardboard bungalow at $80 a month, but at the last minute the firm ordered him to Washington, and I went out to the country alone. I had a dog, at least I had him for a few days until he ran away, and an old doge, and a Finnish woman, who made my bed and cooked breakfast and muttered Finnish wisdom to herself over the electric stove. Hold on, sorry, I'm just absorbing all this because this is a blind reading. So, Alright, so I guess it's like a maid. I'm sorry. I have an English class for this, so I want to make sure this gets absorbed into my head. It was lonely for a day or so until one morning some man, more recently arrived than I, stopped me on the road. "How do you get to West Egg Village?" he asked helplessly. I told him, and as I walked on I was lonely no longer. I was a guide, a pathfinder, an original settler. He had casually conferred on me the freedom of the neighborhood. And so, with the sunshine and the great bursts of leaves growing on the trees just as things grow in fast movies, I had that familiar conviction that life was beginning over again with the summer. There was so much to read, for one thing, and so much fine health to be pulled down out of the young breath-giving air. I bought a dozen volumes on banking and credit and investment securities, and they stood on my shelves in red and gold like new money from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets that only Midas and Morgan and Marcenus knew. And I had the high intention of reading many other books besides. I was rather literary in college. One year I wrote a series of very solemn and obvious editorials for the Yale News. And now I was. Okay, seriously, why is there a dash after a period? Like, I was told very differently in my English class. That isn't how it's supposed to work. The dash is supposed to be the connecting between independent clauses. Never mind. And now I was going to bring back all such things into my life and become, again, that most limited of all specialists, the well-rounded man. This isn't just an epigram. Life is much more successful. Okay, seriously, what is an epigram? Give me a second. Okay. Life is much more successfully looked at from a single window. After all, it was a matter of chance that I should have rented a house in one of the strangest communities in North America. It was on that slender riotous island, which extends itself due east of New York, and where there are, among other natural curiosities, two unusual formations of land. 20 miles from the city, a pair of enormous eggs, identical in contour and separate only by a courtesy bay, jut out into the most domesticated body of salt water in the Western Hemisphere. The Great West Barnyard of Long Island Sound. They are not perfect ovals, like the egg in the Columbus story. They are both crushed flat at the contact end, but their physical resemblance must be a source of perpetual confusion to the gulls that fly overhead. To the wingless, a more arrested phenomenon is their dissimilarity in every particular except shape and size. I live at West Egg, the less fashionable of the two, though this is a very most superficial tag to express the bizarre and not a little sinister contrast between them. My house was at the very tip of the egg, only 50 yards from the sound, and squeezed between two huge places that rented for 12 or 15,000 a season. The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard. It was a factual imitation of some Hotel de Ville in Normandy, with a tower on one side, spanking new under a thin beard of raw ivy, and a marble swimming pool, and more than 40 acres of lawn and garden. It was Gatsby's mansion. Or rather, as I didn't know, Mr. Gatsby, it was a mansion inhabited by a gentleman of that name. My house was an eyesore, but it was a small eyesore, and it had been overlooked, so I had a view of the water, a partial view of my neighbor's lawn, and the consolidating proximity of millionaires, all for $80 a month. Across the courtesy bay, the white palaces of fashionable East Egg glittered along the water, and the history of the summer really begins on the evening as I drove over there to have dinner with the Tong Buchanans. Daisy was my second cousin, once removed, and I'd known Tom in college. And just after the war, I spent 2 days with them in Chicago. Her husband, among various physical accomplishments, had been one of those powerful ends that ever played football at New Haven. A national figure, in a way. One of these men who reached such an acute, limited excellence at 21 that everything afterward savors of anticlimax. His family were enormously wealthy. Even in college, his freedom with money was a matter of reproach. But now he'd left Chicago and come east in a fashion that rather took your breath away. For instance, he'd brought down a string of polo ponies from Lake Forest. It was hard to realize that a man in my own generation was wealthy enough to do that. Why they came east, I don't know. They had spent a year in France for no particular reason, and then drifted here, and they were unrestly wherever people played polo and were rich together. This was a permanent move, said Daisy over the telephone, but I didn't believe it. I had no sight into Daisy's heart, but I felt that Tom would drift on forever, seeking a little wistfully over the dramatic turbulence of some irrecoverable football game. And so it happened that on a warm, windy evening I drove over to East Egg to see two old friends whom I scarcely knew at all. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected. A cheerful, red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The lawn started at the beach and ran toward the front door for a quarter of a mile, jumping over the sundials and brick walls and burning gardens. Finally, when it reached the house, drifting up the side in bright vines, as though from the momentum of its run. The front was broken by a line of French windows, glowing now with reflected gold and wide open to the warm, windy afternoon, and Tom Butchman, in riding clothes, was standing with his legs apart on the front porch. He had changed since his New Haven years. Now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30, with a rather hard mouth and a superfluous manner. Two shining, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face, and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Not even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes could hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to fill those glistening boots until he strained the top lacing, and you could see a great pack of muscles shifting when his shoulder moved under his thin coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. His speaking voice, a gruff, husky tenor, added to the impression of fractiousness he conveyed. There was a touch of paternal contempt in it, even toward people he liked. And there were men at New Haven who had hated his guts. I don't think my opinion on these matters is final, he seemed to say, just because I'm stronger and more of a man than you are. We were in the same senior society, and while we were never intimate, I always had the impression that he approved of me and wanted me to like him, with some harsh, defiant wistfulness of his own. We talked for a few minutes on the sunny porch. I've got a nice place here, he said, his eyes flashing about restlessly. Turning me around by one arm, he moved a broad, flat hand along the front vista, including its sweep a sunken Italian garden, a half-acre of deep, pungent roses, and a snub-nosed motorboat that bumped the tide offshore. It belonged to Domain, the oil man. He turned to me. Oh boy. Hope that didn't make like a freaking shockwave in your eardrums. It belonged to Domain, the oil man. He turned me around again, politely and abruptly. We'll go inside. We walked through a high hallway into a bright, rosy-colored space, fragilely bound into the house by French windows at either end. The windows were ajar and gleaming white against the fresh grass outside that seemed to grow a little way into the house. A breeze blew through the room, blew curtains in at one end and out the other like pale flags, twisting them up toward the frosted wedding cake of the ceiling, and then rippled over the wine-colored rug, making a shadow on it as wind does on the sea. The only completely stationary object in the room was an enormous couch on which two young women were buoyed. Man, I am sucking at my pronunciation today. Buoyed up as though upon an anchored balloon. They were both in white, and their dresses were rippling and fluttering as if they had just been blown back in after a short flight around the house. I must have stood for a few moments listening to the whip and snap of the curtains and the groan of picture on the wall. Then there was a boom as Tom Bookin shut the rear windows, and the cut the cot wind died out all about the room, and the curtains and the rugs and the two young women ballooned slowly to the floor. The younger of the two was a stranger to me. She was extended full length at her end of the divan, completely motionless and with her chin raised a little, as if she were balancing something on it which was quite likely to fall. If she saw me out of the corner of her eyes, she gave no hint of it. Indeed, I was almost surprised into murmuring an apology for having disturbed her by coming in. The other girl, Daisy, made an attempt to rise. She leaned slightly forward with a conscientious expression. Then she laughed. An absurd, charming little laugh, and I laughed too and came forward into the room. "I'm paralyzed with happiness," she laughed again, and as if she said something very witty, and held my hand for a moment, looking up into my face, promising that there was no one in the world she so much wanted to see. Oh boy, I just realized I literally am doing this for 2 hours and 20 minutes straight, aren't I? Oh. Alright, what time are we on? Okay, it's 21 minutes. Okay, I can do this. Where was I? She laughed again, as if she said something very witty, and held my hand for a moment, looking up into my face, promising that there was no one in the world she so much wanted to see. That was a way she had. She hinted in a murmur that the surname of the balancing girl was Baker. I've heard it said that Daisy's murmur was only to make people lean toward her, an irrelevant criticism that made it no less charming. At any rate, Miss Baker's lips fluttered. She nodded at me almost imperceptibly, and then quickly tipped her head back again. The object she was balancing had obviously tottered a little, and given her something of a fright. Again, a sort of apology arose to my lips. Almost any exhibition of complete self-sufficiency draws a stunned tribute from me. I looked back at my cousin, who began to ask me questions in her low, thrilling voice. It was the kind of voice that the ear follows up and down, as if each speech is an arrangement of notes that will never be played again. Sorry, I'm just rereading what I just read. My brain is totally getting wasted here. It was the kind of voice that the ear follows up and down. Her face was sad and lovely. Face was sad and lovely, with bright things in it, bright eyes and a bright, passionate mouth. But there was an excitement in her voice that men who had cared for fawns found difficult to forget, a singing compulsion, a whispered "listen," a promise that she had done gay, exciting things just a while since, and that there were gay, exciting things hovering in the next hour. I told her how I had stopped off in Chicago for a day on my way east, and how a dozen people had sent their love through me. "Do they miss me?" she cried ecstatically. "The whole town is desolate, and the cars have the left rear wheel painted black as a mourning wreath, and there's a persistent wail all night along the North Shore. How gorgeous! Let's go back, Tom. Tomorrow." Then she added irreverently, "You ought to see the baby." "I'd like to." "She's asleep. She's 3 years old. Haven't you ever seen her?" "Never." "Well, you ought to see her. She's—" Tom Bushman, who had been hovering restlessly about the room, stopped and rested his hand on my shoulder. "What you doing, Nick?" "I'm a bondman." "Who with?" I told him. "I never heard of them," he remarked decisively. This annoyed me. Just gotta scroll up. "You will," I answered shortly. You will if you stay in the East. Oh, I'll stay in the East, don't you worry, he said, glancing at Daisy, and then back to me, as if he was alert for something more. I'd be a goddamn fool to live anywhere else. At this point, Miss Baker said, "Absolutely," with such suddenness that I started. It was the first word that she uttered since I came into the room. Evidently, it surprised her as much as it did me, for she yawned and, with a series of rapid, deft movements, stood up into the room. "I'm stiff," she complained. "I've been lying on that sofa for as long as I can remember." "Don't look at me," Daisy retorted. "I've been trying to get you to New York all afternoon." "No, thanks," said Mr. Baker to the 4 cocktails just in from the pantry. "I'm absolutely in training." Her host looked at her incredulously. "You are?" Wait, no, hold on. Was that male or female? It's hard to keep up with this text, alright? Her host looked at her courteously. "You are." He took down his drink as if it were a drop in the bottom of a glass. "How you ever get anything done is beyond me." I looked at Miss Baker, wondering what if was she got done. I enjoyed looking at her. She was a slender, small-breasted girl with an erect carriage. You know, if this was made in the modern day, this would probably... You know what? These kind of jokes are below me. She was a slender, small-breasted girl with an erect carriage, which she accentuated by throwing her body backwards at the shoulder like a young cadet. Her gray... Yeah, nobody uses that word. Gray, sun-strained eyes looked back at me with a polite, reciprocal curiosity out of a wan, charming, discontented with face. It occurred to me now that I had seen her, a picture of her, somewhere before. "You live in West Egg," she remarked, contemptuously. "I know somebody there." "I don't know a single. You must know Gatsby." "Gatsby?" demanded Daisy. "What Gatsby?" Before I could reply that he was my neighbor, dinner was announced. Okay, isn't there supposed to be a comma before neighbor and dinner? Like seriously? Alright, dinner was announced. Wedging his tense arm imperatively under mine, Tom Butchinen compelled me from the room as though he were moving a checker to another square. Slenderly, languidly, their hands set lightly on their hips, the 2 young women preceded us out onto a rosy-colored porch, open toward the sunset, where 4 candles flickered on the table in the diminished wind. "Why candles?" objected Daisy, frowning. She snapped them out with her fingers. "In 2 weeks, it'll be the longest day in the year." She looked at us all radiantly. "Do you always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it? I always watch for the longest day in the year and then miss it." "We ought to plan something," yawned Miss Baker, sitting down on the table if she were getting into bed. "All right. What do we plan?" She turned to me helplessly. "What do people plan?" Before I could answer, her eyes fastened with an odd expression on her little finger. "Look!" she complained. "I hurt it." We all looked. Oh, why does she sound like an old man? I hurt it. We all looked. The knuckle was black and blue. "You did it, Tom," she said accusingly. "I know you didn't meant to, but you did it to it. That's what I get for marrying a brute of a man. A great, big, hulking, physical specimen of a..." "I hate that word, hulking," objected Tom crossly, "even in kidding." "Hulking." Sometimes she and Miss Baker talked at once, obtrusively, and with a bantering inconsequence that was never quite chatter, that was as cool as their white dresses, and with their impersonal eyes in the absence of all desire. They were here, and they accepted Tom and me. making only a polite, pleasant effort to entertain or be entertained. They knew that presently dinner would be over, and a little later in the evening too would be over, and casually put away. It was sharply different from the West, where an evening was hurried from face to face toward its close, in a continually disappointed anticipation, or else in sheer nervous dread of the moment itself. You make me feel uncivilized, Daisy. I confessed on my second glass of corky, but rather impressive claret. Can't you talk about crops or something? I meant nothing in particular by this remark, but it's taken up in an unexpected way. Civilization's going to pieces, broke out Tom violently. I've gotten to be a terrible pessimist about things. Have you read The Rise of the Colored Empress by the main Goddard? Okay, isn't there supposed to be like a single quotation mark? Like the whatever. Why no? I answered, rather surprised by his tone. Well, it's a fine book, and everyone ought to read it. The idea is if we don't look out the... Wait, is he like doing a racist thing here? I think he's doing a racist thing. Well, it's a fine book. And everybody ought to read it. The idea is if we don't look out the white race will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. It's been proven. Tom's getting very profound, said Daisy, with an expression of undauntful sadness. He reads deep books with long words in them. What was that word we... Well, these books are all scientific, insisted Tom, glancing at her impatiently. Okay, you know what? Just because it's a scientific article doesn't mean it's actually scientific. It's messy science. Of course, we have things like sample size. And, when was the scientific method created? Wasn't it made, in the early 1900s or something? Oh, well, whatever. It was a different time. I should stop analyzing this stuff. This fellow has worked out the whole thing. It's up to us, who are the dominant race. Oh, dear, we going into that category. To watch out, or these other races will have control of things. We've got to beat them down, whispered Daisy, winking ferociously toward the fevered sun. You ought to live in California, began Miss Baker, but Tom interrupted her by shifting heavily in his chair. This idea is that we're Nordics. I am, and you are, and after infinitesimal hesitation, he included Daisy with a slight nod, and she winked at me again. And we've produced all the things that go to make civilization. Oh, science and art and all that, do you see? There was something pathetic in his concentration, as if his complacency, more acute than of old, was not enough to him any more. Well, that's probably a word I know, but I probably can't remember the definition. What was it again? Complacently, a feeling of smug or uncritical satisfaction with oneself. Okay, so it's like ego / pride. Like very bad ego. Where was I? As if his complacency, more acute than of old, was not enough to hit him any more, when almost immediately the telephone rang inside and the butler left the porch. Daisy seized upon the momentary interruption and leaned toward me. I'll tell you a family secret, she whispered enthusiastically. It's about the butler's nose. Do you want to hear about the butler's nose? That's what I came over to tonight. Well, he wasn't always a butler. He used to be a silver polisher for some people in New York that had a silver service for 200 people. He had to polish it from morning till night, until it began to affect his nose. So wait, with this butler guy, he's like, okay, he used to be a silver polisher for some people. Things went from bad to worse. Yes, things went from bad to worse until finally he had to give up his position. For a moment, the last sunshine fell with romantic affection upon her glowing face. Her voice compelled me forward breathlessly as I listened. Then the glow faded, each light deserting her with lingering regret, like children leaving a pleasant street at dusk. The butler came back and murmured something close to Tom's ear, whereupon Tom frowned, pushed back his chair, and without a word went inside, as if his absence quickened something within her. Daisy leaned forward again, her voice glowing and singing. "I love to see you at my table, Nick. You remind me of a rose, an absolute rose, doesn't he?" She turned to Miss Baker for confirmation. "An absolute rose." This was untrue. I am not even faintly like a rose. She was only extemporizing. Oh, that's another word I don't know. I'm sorry. I have to be that guy who looks it up all the time. Okay, improvise. So you like jazz? Where was it? Oh god, I think I'm starting to get actually tired here. How long? Wow. I have a lot to go by. Um, extemporizing, but a stirring warmth followed from her, as if her heart was trying to come out to you, concealed in one of those breathless, thrilling words. Then suddenly she threw a napkin on the table and excused herself and went into the house. Miss Baker and I exchanged a short glance, consciously devoid of meaning. I was about to speak when she sat up alertly and said, "Shh," in a warning voice. A subdued, impassioned murmur was audible in the room beyond, and Miss Baker leaned forward. I'm sorry, my brain sort of leaked out of its ear for a second there. A subdued, impassioned murmur was audible in the room beyond, and Miss Baker leaned forward unashamed, trying to hear. The murmur trembled on the verge of coherence, sank down, mounted excitedly, and then ceased altogether. "This Mr. Gatsby you spoke of is my neighbor," I said. "Don't talk. I want to hear what happens." "Is something happening? You mean to say you don't know?" said Miss Baker, honestly surprised. "I thought everybody knew." "I don't." "Why?" she said hesitantly. "Tom has got some woman in New York." "Got some woman?" Miss Baker nodded. "She might have the decency not to telephone him at dinner time." "Don't you think?" Almost before I had grasped her meaning, there was the flutter of a dress and the crunch of leather boots, and Tom and Daisy were back at the table. "It couldn't be helped!" cried Daisy with tense gaiety. Okay, so very, I guess, gay would be a word they would use for gaiety. She sat down, glanced searchingly at Miss Baker and then at me, and continued. "I looked outdoors for a minute, and it's very romantic outdoors. There's a bird on the lawn that I think must be a nightingale. Come over on the Cunard or White Star Line. He's singing away." Her voice rang. "It's romantic, isn't it, Tom?" "Very romantic," he said, and then miserably to me, if it's light enough after dinner, I want to take you down to the stables." The telephone rang inside, startlingly, and as Daisy shook her head decisively at Tom, the subject of the stables, in fact all subjects, vanished into air. Among the broken fragments of the last 5 minutes at table, I remember the candles being lit again, pointlessly, and I was conscious of wanting to look squarely at everyone. And yet, to avoid all eyes, I couldn't guess what Daisy and Tom were thinking. But I doubt even Miss Baker, who seemed to have mastered a certain hearty skepticism. Sorry, that was my throat crying out there for a second. Uh, I was conscious of wanting to look squarely at everyone, and yet to avoid all eyes, I couldn't guess what Daisy and Tom were thinking. But I doubt if even Miss Baker. Huh. I have three people watching me now. Um. I don't get a lot of visitors on these live streams. I just want to know if there's like anyone actually here. Just type something in. If you're here. Uh, I couldn't guess what Daisy and Tom were thinking, but I doubt if even Miss Baker, who seemed to have mastered a certain hearty skepticism, was able utterly to put this fifth guess's shrill metallic urgency out of mind. To a certain temperate, the situation might have seemed intriguing. My own instinct was to telephone immediately for the police. Wow, there's like four people now. Wow, it's climbing. The horses, needless to say, were not mentioned again. Tom and Miss Baker, with several feet of twilight between them, strolled back into the library, as if to a vigil. Vigil? Oh, forget it. Beside a perfectly tangible body, while trying to look pleasantly interested and a little deaf, I followed Daisy around a chain of connecting verandas to the porch in front. In its deep gloom, we sat down side by side on a wicker set. Daisy took her face in the hands of it, feeling its lovely shape, and her eyes moving graduously out into the velvet dusk. I saw that turbulent emotion possessed her, so I asked what I thought would be some sedative questions about her little girl. "We don't know each other very well, Nick," she said suddenly. "Even if we were our cousins, you didn't come to my wedding." "I wasn't back from the war." "That's true. Well, I've had a very bad time, Nick, and I'm pretty cynical about everything." Evidently, she had reason to be. I waited, but she didn't say any more, and after a moment I returned rather feebly to the subject of her daughter. "I suppose she talks and eats and everything?" "Oh, yes." She looked at me absently. "Listen, Nick, let me tell you what I said when she was born. Would you like to hear?" "Very much. It'll show you how I've gotten to feel about things. Well, she was less than an hour old, and Tom was God knows where. I woke out of the ether with an utterly abandoned feeling, and asked the nurse right away if it was a boy or a girl. She told me it was a girl, and so I turned my head away and wept. 'All right,' I said. 'I'm glad it's a girl. It helps she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world. I'll be a little fool.'" Okay, I guess he's trying to do some subtle, social commentary of the 1920s. Yeah, who cares? I'll leave spark notes to the analyzing. And I hope she'll be a fool. Okay, you see, I think everything's terrible anyhow. She went on in a convinced way. "Everything thinks so. The most advanced people. And I know. I've been everywhere, seen everything, and done everything." Her eyes flashed around her in a defiant way, rather like Tom's, and she laughed with thrilling scorn. "Sophisticated! God, I'm sophisticated!" The instant her voice broke off, ceasing to compel my attention, my belief, I felt the basic insincerity of what she had said. It made me uneasy, as though the whole evening had been a trick of some sort to exact a contributory emotion from me. I waited, and sure enough, in a moment, she looked at me with an absolute smirk on her lovely face, as if she had asserted her membership in a rather distinguished secret society to which she and Tom belonged. Ah, God. I'm sorry. What time am I in? 45 minutes. Oh dear. Oh dear. I'm going to be here for a long time. Inside, the crimson room bloomed with light. Tom and Miss Baker sat at either end of the long couch, and she read along to him with the Saturday Evening Post. The words murmurous and unaffected running together in a soothing tune. The lamplight, bright on his boots, and dull on the autumn leaf yellow of her hair, glinted along the paper as if she turned the page with a flutter of slender muscles in her arms. When we came in, she held us silent for a moment with a lifted hand. "To be continued," she said, tossing the magazine on the table, "in our very next issue." That's my mind just going insane there. Her body asserted itself with a restless movement of her knee, and she stood up. 10 o'clock, she remarked, apparently finding the time on the ceiling. Time for this good girl to go bed. Go to bed. Jordan's going to play in the tournament tomorrow, explained Daisy over at apparently there's like one person here. Okay. Over at Worcester. Oh, you're Jonathan Banker. I knew now why her face was familiar. Its pleasing, contemptuous expression had looked out at me with many rotogravure pictures of the sporting life at Asheville, at Hot Springs, and Palm Beach. I had heard some story of her too, a critical, unpleasant story, but it was what I had forgotten long ago. "Good night," she said softly. "Wake me at 8, won't you? If you'll get up, I will." "Good night, Mr. Carroway. See you anon." "Of course you will," confirmed Daisy. "In fact, I think I'll arrange a marriage. Come over often, Nick. Sort of. Oh, fling you together. Lock you up accidentally in linen closets and push you out to sea in a boat and all that sort of thing." "Good night," called Miss Baker from the stairs. "I haven't heard a word. She's a nice girl," said Tom after a moment. "They oughtn't to let her run around the country this way." Sorry, my throat was crying again. Good night, called Miss Baker from the stairs. "I haven't heard a word. She's a nice girl. Who ought to do?" Her family. Her family is one aunt, about 1,000 years old. Besides, Nick's going to look after her, aren't you, Nick? She's going to spend lots of weekends out here this summer. I think the home influence will be very good for her." Daisy and Tom looked at each other for a moment in silence. Sorry, my brain was just processing what I just read. "Is she from New York?" I asked quickly. "From Louisville. Our white girlhood was passed together there. Our beautiful white..." "Did you give Nick a little heart-to-heart talk on the veranda?" demanded Tom suddenly. "Did I?" She looked at me. "I didn't. I can't seem to remember, but I think we talked about the Nordic race." "Yes, I'm sure we did. It's sort of crept up on us, and first thing you know..." "Don't believe everything you hear, Nick," he advised me. I said lightly that I had heard nothing at all. "Okay, wait, is she lying to him? 'Cause, I can't seem to remember, but I think we talked about the..." She looked at me. "Okay, yeah, I think, they are lying, because Tom likes being racist, I guess. I don't know, maybe he's secretly Hitler's long-lost cousin. Don't believe everything you hear, Nick," he advised me. I said lightly that I had heard nothing at all, and a few minutes later I got up to go home. They came to the door with me and stood side by side in a cheerful square of light. As I started my motor, Daisy peremptorily called, "Wait! I forgot to ask you something, and it's important. We heard you were engaged to a girl out west." "That's right," corroborate. Okay, I get it. You have a 300 IQ when it comes to writing. You're just Fitzgerald, my nemesis. Fudge. Let me put this among myself. That's right, corroborated Tom kindly. We heard that you were engaged. It's libel. I'm too poor. But we heard it, insisted Daisy, surprising me by opening up again in a flower-like way. We heard it from 3 people, so it must be true. Of course, I knew what they were referring to, but I wasn't even vaguely engaged. The fact that gossip had published the bans was one of the reasons I'd come east. You can't stop going with an old friend on account of rumors. And on the other hand, I had no intention of being rumored into marriage. Their interests rather touched me and made me less remotely rich. Nevertheless, I was confused and a little disgusted as I drove away. It seemed to me that the thing for Daisy to do was to rush out of the house, child in arms, but apparently there was no such intentions in her head. As for Tom, the fact that he had some woman in New York was really less surprising than that he had been depressed by a book. Something was making him nibble at the edge of stale ideas, as if his sturdy physical egotism no longer nourished his peremptorily heart. Oh, burn. Oh, egotism. Nourished. Ha, I get you, Fitzgerald. You're really a 300 IQ person. Oh, God, why am I sitting in this chair? Okay, I'm over it. Okay, their interests rather... Oh, yeah. Already it was deep summer on the roundhouse roofs and in front of wayside garages where new red gas pumps sat out in pools of light. And when I reached my estate at West Egg, I ran the car under its shed and sat for a while on an abandoned grass roller in the yard. The wind had blown off, leaving a loud, bright night with swings beating in the trees, and a persistent organ sound as the full bellows of the earth blew the frogs full of life. The silhouette of a moving cat wavered across the moonlight, and turning my head to watch it, I saw that I was not alone. 50 feet away, a figure had emerged from the shadow of my neighbor's mansion, and was standing with in his pocket regarding the silver pepper and the stars. Oh my God, is it Batman? I bet it's Batman. Stars, was something in his leisurely movements and his secure position of feet down suggested that it was Mr. Gatsby himself, come out to determine what share was his of our local heavens. Okay, I guess it isn't Batman. I decided to call to him. Miss Baker had mentioned him at dinner, and that would do for an introduction, but I didn't call to him, for he gave a sudden that's some good Coca-Cola. Intimation that he was content to be alone. He stretched out his arms toward the dark water in a curious way, and far as I was from him, I could have sworn he was tremulously. Involuntarily, I glanced seaward and distinguished nothing except a single green light minute far away. That might have been the end of a dock. When I looked once more, for Gatsby had vanished, and I was alone again in the unquiet darkness. Okay, first of all, what kind of book has the character named after the book's title come at the end of the chapter 1? Second of all, this is like the exact premise of what was that like male caretaker from Turn of the Screw? I can't remember. I don't know. I read the book. Maybe it's like they influence each other, the books. Whatever. Chapter 2. Actually, hold on real quick. Hold on. Okay, I just want to check like how many chapters there are. Okay, there's 9. Okay. I can get through this. I'm really eating that horse, so to speak. Uh, about halfway between West Egg and New York, the motor road hastily joins the railroad and runs beside it for a quarter of a mile, so as to shrink away from a certain desolate area of land. This is a valley of ashes, a fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges, and hills and grotesque gardens where ashes take the form of houses and chimney and rising smoke, and finally, with a transcendent effort of men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. Okay, I'm not gonna end my life today. I'm gonna finish this. I'm gonna finish this. Ugh. Occasionally, a line of gray cars crawls along an invisible track, gives out a ghastly creak, and comes to rest. And immediately, the ash-gray men swarm up with leaden spades and stir up an impenetrable cloud, which screens their obscure operations from your sight. But above the gray land, and the spasms of bleak dust which drift effortlessly over it, you perceive, after a moment, the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg are blue and gigantic. You know, you could have just said his eyes are blue and gigantic, or whatever. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg are blue and gigantic. Their irises are 1 yard high. Okay, seriously. Okay, first of all, if his eyes are, as you said, okay, what the hell? Their irises are 1 yard high. Okay, if that was the case, okay, assuming the eye proportions are the same, he would just like have this. So you're telling me that this guy has irises so large that his face is covered by his irises. You're telling me. You're telling me the hyperbole is that strong. Like, I get that I'm Asian, so I don't have the largest irises, but that's like me going to the size of, like, I could touch the ceiling by jumping and touching my irises up there. Okay, whatever. Okay, I need to stay focused. I need to. Boogers, don't pick your boogers, kids. I don't know. I'm pretty sure my humor isn't even for kids, so I might even say. Time to get back to reading. Okay. Where was I? Dr. TJ. Their irises are 1 yard high. They look out of no face, but instead from a pair of enormous yellow spectacles. Oh, he has a same concept. Spectacles which pass over a non-existent nose. So basically, an anime character. Am I right? Non-existent nose, large eyes. If forget it, there's probably like nobody who gets that joke. Evidently, some wild wag of an occultist set them there to flatten his practice in the borough of Queens, and then sank down himself into the eternal blindness, or forgot them and moved away. But his eyes, dimmed a little by many paintless days under sun and rain, brood and over the solemn dumping ground. The Valley of Ashes is bounded on one side by small foul river, and when the drawbridge is up to let barges through, the passengers on waiting trains can stare at the dismal scene for as long as half an hour. That is always a halt there of at least a minute, and it was because of this that I first met Tom Bruchnan's mistress. The fact that he had one was insisted upon wherever he was known. His acquaintances resented the fact that he turned up in popular restaurants with her and leaving at a table sauntered about chatting with whomo, whomsoever he knew. Though I was curious to see her, I had no desire to meet her. But I did. I went up to New York with Tom on the train one afternoon, and when we stopped by the ash heaps, he jumped to his feet and, taking hold of my elbow, literally forced me from the car. "We're getting off," he insisted. "I want you to meet my girl." I think he'd tanked up a good deal at luncheon, and his determination to have my company bordered on violence. The boy, does Fitzgerald like that word, superfluous assumption was that on Sunday afternoon I had nothing better to do. I followed him over a low, whitewashed railroad fence, and he walked back 100 yards along the road under Dr. Eckberg's persistent stare. The only building in sight was a small block of yellow brick sitting on the edge of the wasteland, a sort of compact main street ministering to it, and contiguous to absolutely nothing. One of the 3 shops it contained was for rent, and another was an all-night restaurant approached by a trail of ashes. The third was a garage. Repairs, George B. Wilson. Cars bought and sold, and I followed Tom inside. The interior was unprosperous and bare. The only car visible was the dust-covered wreck of a Ford, which crouched in a dim corner. It had occurred to me that his shadow of a garage must be a blind, and that sumptuous and romantic apartments were concealed overhead. When the proprietor himself appeared in the door of an office, wiping his hands on a piece of waste. He was a blond, spiritless man, anemic and faintly handsome. My brain is trying to process what he just said. When he saw us, a damp gleam of hope sprang into his light blue eyes. "Hello, Wilson, old man," said Tom, slapping him jovially on the shoulder. "How's business?" "I can't complain," answered Wilson unconvincingly. "When are you going to sell me that car?" "Next week. I've got my man working on it now." "Works pretty slow, doesn't he? Don't he?" "No, he doesn't," said Tom coldly. "And if you feel that way about it, maybe I'd better sell it somewhere else, after all." "I don't mean that," explained Wilson quickly. "I just meant—" His voice faded off, and Tom glanced impatiently around the garage. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs. In a moment, the thickish figure of a woman blocked out the light from the office door. She was in the middle 30s and faintly stout, but she carried her surplus flesh sensuously, as some women can. Her face, above a spotted dress of dark blue crepe de chine, contained no facet or gleam of beauty, but there was an immediately perceptible vitality about her, as if the nerves of her body was continuously smoldering. She smiled slowly, and walking through her husband as if he were ghost, shook hands with Tom. Looking him flashing-eyed. Then she wet her lips without turning around, spoke to her husband in his soft, coarse voice. "Get some chairs, why don't you, so somebody can sit down?" "Oh, sure," agreed Wilson hurriedly, and went down towards the little office. Immediately with the cement colors of the walls, a white ashen dust veiled his dark suit and his pale hair, as it veiled everything in the vicinity except his wife, who moved close to Tom. "Oh, I want to see you," said Tom intently. "Get on the next train." "All right. I'll meet you by the newsstand on the lower level." She nodded and moved away from him just as George Wilson emerged from 2 chairs from his office door. He waited for her down the road,
and out of sight. It was a few days before the 4th of July, and a gray, scrawny Italian child was setting torpedoes in a row along the railroad track. Terrible place, isn't it? Said Tom, exchanging a frown with Dr. Engelberg. Awful. It does her good to get away. Doesn't her husband object? Wilson, he thinks she goes to see her sister in New York. He's so dumb he doesn't know how he... Wilson, he thinks he goes...
I need to focus. It's like I'm beaming like waves of consciousness towards this piece of text. Wilson, he thinks she goes to see her sister in New York. He's so dumb he doesn't know he's alive. So Tom Butchnan and his girl and I went up together to New York. We're not quite together, for Mrs. Wilson sat discreetly in another car. Tom deferred that much to the sensibility of those eager eggers who might be on the train. She had changed her dress to a brown-figured muslin, which stretched tight over her rather wide hips, as Tom helped her to the platform in New York. At the newsstand, she bought a copy of Town Tattle and a moving picture magazine, and in the station drugstore some cold cream and a small flask of perfume. Upstairs in the solemn, echoing drive, she let 4 taxicabs drive away before she selected a new one, lavender colored with gray upholstery, and in this we slid out from the mass of the station into the glowing sunshine. But immediately she turned sharply from the window and, leaning forward, tapped on the front glass. "I want to get one of those dogs," she said earnestly. "I want to get one for this apartment. They're nice to have. Dog. We have a gray old man who bore an absurd resemblance to John D. Rockefeller. In a basket swung from his neck cowered a dozen very recent all right. We backed up to a gray old man who bore in a basket swung from his neck cowered a dozen very recent puppies of an indeterminate breed. "What kind are they?" asked Mrs. Wilson eagerly as he came to the taxi window. "All kinds. What kind do you want, lady?" "I'd like to get one of those police dogs." "I don't suppose you got that kind." The man peered doubtfully into his basket, plunged into his hand, and drew one up, wiggling by the neck of his neck. "That's no police dog," said Dom. "No, it's not exactly a police dog." "Okay, seriously, why is this one italicized in the... Who cares?" said the man with disappointment in his voice. "It's more of an iridolay." He passed his hand over the brown wash rag back. "Look at that coat. Some coat. That's a dog that'll never bother you with catching cold." Okay, so exactly why is this a modern classic? This just feels like a bunch of accounts of someone's everyday life. Where's the deep philosophical implications? Where's the glistening humor? The great insight? Why is this so classical? Oh, God. Okay. Okay. All right. I'll get through this. I'll get through this.
Proceed. All kinds. What do you want, lady? No, it's not exactly a police dog, said the man with disappointment in his voice. It's more of an Airedale. He passed his hands over them. I think it's cute, said Mrs. Wilson enthusiastically. How much is it? That dog? He looked at it mildly. That dog will cost you $10. What? Do dogs actually cost that? I'm pretty sure they're like in the thousands. Much to adopt a dog. Okay, I don't actually know the adoption fee, but I'm pretty sure it's in the hundreds. But I guess there's inflation, so whatever. Okay, the dog costs $10. The Airedale, undoubtedly there was an Airedale concerned in there somewhere. Though its feet were startlingly wide, changed hands and settled down into Mrs. Wilson's lap, where she fondled the weatherproof coat with rapture. Is it a boy or a girl? She asked delicately. Dog's a boy. It's a bitch, said Tom decisively. Here's your money. Go and buy 10 more dogs with it. We drove over to Fifth Avenue, so warm and soft, almost pastoral, on the summer Sunday afternoon that I wouldn't have been surprised to see a great flock of white sheep turn the other corner. Hold on, I said. I have to leave you here. No, you don't, interposed Tom quickly. Murder will be heard. If you don't come up to the apartment, won't you, Mineral? Come on, she urged. I'll telephone my sister Catherine. She's said to be very beautiful by people who ought to know. Well, I'd like to, but we went on, cutting back again over the park toward the West Hundreds. At 158th Street, the cab dropped at one slice in a long white cake of apartment houses, throwing a regal homecoming glance around the neighborhood. Mrs. Wilson gathered up her dog and her other purchases and went haughtily in. I'm going to have the keys come up, she announced as we rose in the elevator. And of course, I got to call up my sister too. The apartment was on the top floor, a small living room, a small dining room, a small bedroom, and a bath. The living room was crowded to the doors with a set of tapestried furniture, entirely too large for it, so that to move about was to stumble continually over scenes of ladies swinging in the gardens of Versailles. I feel like I know the word Versailles, but I can't remember. The only picture was an over-enlarged photograph, apparently then sitting on a blurred rock, looked at from a distance. However, the head resolved itself into a bonnet, and the contents, a stout old lady, beamed down into the room. Several old copies of Town Tattle lay on the table, together with a copy of Simon Called Peter, and some of the small scandal magazines of Broadway. Mrs. Wilson was first concerned with the dog. A reluctant elevator boy went for a box full of straw and some milk, to which he added on his own initiative a tin of large, hard dog biscuits, one of which was decomposed apathetically into the saucer of milk all afternoon. Meanwhile, Tom brought out a bottle of whiskey from a locked bureau door. I have been drunk just twice in my life, and the second time was that afternoon, so everything that happened was a dim, hazy cast over it. Although until after 8 o'clock, the apartment was full of cheerful sun. Sitting on Tom's lap, Mrs. Wilson called up several people on the telephone. Then there were no cigarettes, and I went out to buy some at the drugstore on the corner. When I came back, they had disappeared, so I sat down discreetly in the living room and read the chapter Simon Called Peter. Either it was terrible stuff or the whiskey distorted stuff, because it didn't make any sense to me. Yeah, just like this book. Just as Tom and Myrtle, after this first drink, Mrs. Wilson and I called each other by our first names, reappeared. Company commenced to arrive at the escarpment door. The sister Catherine was a slender, worldly girl of about 30, with a solid, sticky bob of red hair and a complexion powdered milky white. Her eyebrows had been plucked and then drawn on again at a more rakish angle, but the efforts of nature toward the restoration of the old alignment gave a blurred air to the face. When she moved about, there was an incessant clicking as innumerable pottery bracelets jinged up and down upon her arms. She came in with such a proprietary haste and looked around so pacifically at the furniture that I wondered if she lived here. But when I asked her, she glanced immoderately, repeated my question aloud, and told me she lived with a girlfriend at this hotel. Mr. McKee was a pale, feminine man from the flat below. He had just shaved, for there was a white spot of lather on his cheekbone, and he was most respectful in his greeting to everyone in the room. He informed me that he was in the artistic game, and I gathered later that he was a photographer and had made the dim enlargement of Mrs. Wilson's mother, which hovered like an ectoplasm on the wall. Okay, I get that one. That's like a whole ghost-like thing. And I learned that he was his wife was shrill, languid, handsome, and horrible. She told me with pride that her husband had photographed her 177 times. Mrs. Wilson had changed her costume some time before, and was now attired in an elaborate afternoon dress of cream-colored chiffon, which gave out a continual rustle as she swept across the room. With the influence of the dress, her personality had undergone a change. The intense vitality that had been so remarkable in the garage was converted into oppressive hauteur. Her laughter, gestures, her gestures became more violently affected moment by moment. She expanded the room, grew older, smaller around her, until she moving on a noisy, creaking pivot through the smoke flare. Well, I guess clothes make the man, I guess. I don't know, is that the saying? It's probably the saying. My dear, she told her sister in a high, mincing about shout, most of these fellas will cheat you every time. All they think about is money. I had a woman up here last week to look at my feet, and when she gave me the bill, you'd have thought she had my appendicitis out. What was the name of the woman? Asked Mrs. McKee. Mrs. Everett. She goes around looking at people's feet in their own homes. I like your dress, remarked Mrs. McKee. I think it's adorable. Mrs. Wilson rejected the comment by raising her eyebrow in disdain. It's just a crazy old thing, she said. I just slip it on sometimes when I don't care what I look like. But it looks wonderful on you, if you know what I mean, pursued Mrs. McKee. Is that a Rodney Dangerfield-like thing? Okay, whatever. If Chester could only get you in that pose, I think he could make something of it. We all looked into silence as Mrs. Wilson, who removed a strand of hair from over her eyes and looked back at us with a brilliant smile. Mr. McKee regarded her intently, with his head on one side, and then moved his hand back or forth in the front of his face. Wait, so he regarded his intent with his head on his one side, and then moved his hand back and forth in front of his... Whatever. I should change the light, he said after a moment. I'd like to bring out the modeling of the features, and I'd like to go hold of the black of the back hair. I wouldn't think of changing the light, cried Mrs. McKee. I think it's. Her husband said, "Shh." And we all looked at the subject again, whereupon Tom Butchkin yawned audibly and got to his feet.
You, McKees, have something to drink. Get some more ice and mineral water. Myrtle before everybody goes to sleep. I told that boy about the ice. Oh god, my brain. I think I myself just going through a hangover. Haven't even drank a drop of alcohol in my life, but this might as well be intoxicating in the worst possible manner. You McKees have something to drink, he said. Get some more ice and mineral water. I told that boy about the ice. Myrtle raised her eyebrows in despair at the shiftiness of the lower orders. These people, you have to keep them after them all the time. She looked at me and laughed pointlessly. Then she flounced over to the dog, kissed it with ecstasy, gross, and swept into the kitchen, implying that a dozen chefs awaited her orders there. I've done some nice things out on Long Island, asserted Mr. McKee. Tom looked at him blankly. 2 of them we have framed downstairs. 2 what? 2 studies. One of them I call Montagne Point, the Gulls, and the other I call Montagne Point, the sea. The sister Catherine sat down beside me on the couch. Do you live alone on Long Island too? She inquired. I live at West Egg. Really? I was down there at a party about a month ago at a man named Gatsby. Do you know what? Maybe we'll actually see him in this chapter in full light. Huh? Whatever. I live next down to him. Yeah, is that like his reply to everything? Gatsby related. I live next to him. Oh, weird. Okay, so. Well, they say he's a nephew or cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm's. That's where all his money comes from. Really? She nodded. I'm scared of him. I'd hate to have him get anything on me. This absorbing information about my neighbor was interrupted by Mrs. McKee's pointing suddenly at Catherine. Chester, I think you could do something with her, she broke out, but Mr. McKee only nodded in a bored way and turned his attention to Tom. I'd like to do more work on Long Island if I should get the entry. All I ask is that we should give me a start. Asked Myrtle, said Tom, breaking into the short sound. Short sound laughter as Mrs. Oh, my body's rejecting this. Oh God. Oh God. Do what? She asked, startled. You'll give McKee a letter of introduction to your husband so he can do some studies of him. Wait, hold on. What is she talking about? Chester, I think you should do something with her. She broke out, but Mr. McKee only nodded in a bored way and turned his attention to Tom. I'd like to do more work on Long Island if I could get the entry. All I ask is that we should get me started. Ask Myrtle, said Tom, breaking into a short shout of laughter. She'll give you a letter of introduction, won't you, Myrtle? To what? She'll give Mr. McKee a letter of introduction to your husband so he can do some studies of him. His lips moved silently for a moment as he reinvented. George B. Wilson's at the gasoline pump or something like that. Catherine leaned close to me and whispered in my ear, Neither of them can stand the person they're married to. Can't they? Can't stand them. She looked at Myrtle and then at Tom. What I say is, why go on living with them if they can't stand them? If I was them, I'd get a divorce and get married to each other right away. Wasn't she like Wilson either? The answer to this was unexpected. It came from Myrtle, who had overheard the question as violent and obscene. You see, cried. You see, you see, Jimbo. You see, Jimbo, cried Catherine triumphantly. She lowered her voice again. It's really his wife that keeps them apart. She's a Catholic, and they don't believe in divorce. Daisy was not a Catholic, and I was a little shocked at the hilarious of the lie. You know, and they do get married. I need to focus. I need to freaking focus. When they do get married, continued Catherine, they're going west to live for a while until it blows over. It must be more discreet to go to Europe. Oh, do you like Europe? She exclaimed surprisingly. I just go back from Monte Carlo. Really, just last year I went over there with another girl. Stay long? No, we went to Monte Carlo and back. We went by way of Marseilles. We had over $1,200 when we started, but we got chipped out of it all in the 2 days in the private. We had an awful time getting back. I can tell you, God, how I hated that town. The late afternoon sky bloomed in the window for a moment like the blue honey of the Mediterranean. Then the shrill voice of Mrs. McKee called me back into the room. I almost made a mistake, too, she declared vigorously. I almost married a little kike who'd been after me for years. I know. I knew he was below me. Everybody kept saying to me, Lucille, the man's way below you, but if I hadn't met Chester, he'd get me sure. Yes, but listen, said Myrtle Wilson, nodding her head up and down. At least you didn't marry him. I know I didn't. Well, I married him, said Myrtle, and that's the difference between your case and mine. Why did you, Myrtle? Nobody forced you to. Yeah, just be like everybody else, man, and just like not marry at all. Just be virgin for life. You know what I'm saying? What am I saying? Yes, but listen, said Miss Mary. No, you're not. Oh, I married him because I thought he was a gentleman, she said finally. I thought he knew something about breeding, but he wasn't fit to lick my shoe. You were crazy about him for a while. Crazy about him? Who said I was crazy about him? I never was any more crazy about him than I was about that man over there. She pointed suddenly at me, and everyone looked at me accusingly. I tried to show off my expression that I had played no part in her past. Yeah, way to put him on the spot, man. You ever had that like moment in like a conversation and someone just awkward, like they try to shift? Whatever. Crazy about him, cried Miss Crunsley. The only crazy I was when I was married him. I knew right away I made a mistake. He borrowed somebody's best suit to get married in and never even told me about it. And the man came after it one day when he was out. Oh, is that your suit? I said this is the first time I ever heard about it, but I gave it to him and then I laid down and cried to beat the band all afternoon. She really ought to get away from him, resumed Catherine to me. They've been living over that garage for 11 years, and Tom's the first sweetie she ever had. The bottle of whiskey, a second one, was now in constant demand by all present, excepting Catherine, who felt just as good as on nothing at all. Tom rang for the janitor and sent him for some celebrated sandwiches for which was a complete supper in themselves. I wanted to get out and walk southward towards the park through the soft twilight.
I wanted to get out and walk southward toward the park through the soft twilight. But each time I tried to go, I became entangled in some wild, strident argument which pulled me back as if with ropes into my chair. Yet high over the city, or line of yellow windows must have contributed their share of even society. To the casual watcher in the darkening streets, and I was him too, looking up and wondering. I was within and without, simultaneously enchanted and repelled by the inexhaustible variety of life. Wow, that's deep, man. Tell me more. Ugh, ugh. Muriel pulled her chair in close to mine, and suddenly her warm breath poured over me to the story of her first meeting with Tom. It was on the two little seats facing each other that are always the last ones left on a train. I was going up to New York to see my sister and spend the night. He had on a dress suit and patent leather shoes, and I couldn't lay off my eyes off him. But every time he looked at me, I had to pretend to be looking at the end. When we came to the station, he was next to me, and his white shirt front pressed along my arm. And so I told him I'd have to call a policeman, but he knew I lied. I was so excited that when I got into the taxi with him, I didn't hardly know I wasn't getting into a subway train. All I kept thinking about over and over was, you can't live forever. You can't live forever. That's right. You gotta turn back, you idiot. Gotta turn back. You're just gonna get more lonely as you grow up. And as you get more lonely, you're just gonna fill your life with meaningless crap. Like a new computer, or a new microphone, or a new monitor. And you'll just go insane thinking what could have happened. And you'll just end up choking yourself while reading a book that nobody gives a crap about. She turned to Mrs. McKee, and the room rang full of her artificial laughter. "My dear," she cried, "I'm going to give you this dress as soon as I am through with it. I've got to get another one tomorrow. I'm going to make a list of all the things got to do. A massage, and a wave, and a collar for the dog, and one of those cute little ashtrays where you touch a spring, and a wreath with a black silk bow for Mother's grave that'll last all summer. I got to write down the list so I won't forget all the things I got to do." It was 9 o'clock, almost immediately afterward. I looked at my watch and found it was 10. Mr. McKee was asleep on a chair with his fist clenched in his lap, like a photograph of a man of action. Taking out my handkerchief, I wiped from his cheek the remains of the spot of dry lather that had worried me all this afternoon. The little dog was sitting on the table, looking with blind eyes through the smoke, and from time to time groaning faintly. People disappeared, reappeared, made plans to go somewhere, and then lost each other. Searching for each other, found each other a few feet away. Sometime toward midnight, Tom Buchanan and Mrs. Wilson stood face to face, discussing in impassioned voices whether Mrs. Wilson had any right to mention Daisy's name. "Daisy, Daisy, give me your answer due. I'm half crazy, all for the love of you. It won't be a stylish marriage. I can't afford a carriage, but you'll look sweet upon the seat of a bicycle built for two." I don't know where that came from. "Daisy, Daisy, Daisy," shouted Mrs. Wilson. "I'll say it whenever I want to. Daisy, Daisy." Making a short, deft movement, Tom Buchanan
broke her nose with his open, and damn, he socked her in the nose. Ugh! 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 Making a short, deft movement, Tom Bushman broke her nose open. Then there was bloody towels upon the bathroom floor, and a woman's voices scolding, and high over the confusion as long, broken wail of pain. Mr. McKee awoke with his doze, and started in a daze towards the door. When he had gone halfway, he turned around and started seeing his wife and Catherine scolding, consoling as they stood there and there among the crowd and the furniture with his violent aid, and the disparaging figure on the couch, bleeding feelingly, and trying to spread a copy of Town Tattle over the tapestry scenes of recitals. Then Mr. McKee turned and looked out of the door, taking my hat from the chandelier. I followed. Come to lunch someday, he suggested. He groaned down the elevator. Where? Anywhere. Keep your hands off the lever, snapped the elevator boy. I beg your pardon, said Mr. Key with dignity. I didn't know I was touching it. All right. All right. All right. I'll be glad to. Standing beside his bed, and he was leaning up at his seat, clad in honor with a great pavilion. Beauty and the Beast, Loneliness, Old Grocery Horse, Broken Bridge. There when I was landing in the cold lower level of the Pennsylvania State, staring at the Morning Tribune and waiting for the 4 o'clock train. There was music from my neighbor's house through the summer nights. In his blue gardens, men and girls came and went like moths around the whispering and the champagne and the stars. At high tide in the afternoon, I watched his guests driving from the tower of his raft or taking the sun on the hot sand of the beach while his 2 motorboats slit the waters of the Sound, drawing aquaplanes over cataracts of foam. On weekends, his Rolls Royce became an omnibus, bearing parties to and from the city between 9 in the morning and long past midnight, while a station wagon scampered like a brisk yellow bug to meet all trains. And on Mondays, 8 servants, including an extra gardener, toiled all day with mops and scrubbing brushes and hammers and garden shears, repairing the ravages of the night before. Okay, so it kind of looks like some afternoon of a frat party. I don't know. Every Friday, 5 crates of young oranges and lemons arrived from a fruitier in New York. Every Monday, these same oranges and lemons left his back door in a pyramid of pulpless halves. There was a machine in the kitchen which could extract the juice of 200 oranges in half an hour if a little button was pressed 200 times by a butler's thumb. At least once a fortnight, a corpse of caterers came down with several hundred feet of canvas and bright enough colored lightings to make a Christmas tree of Gatsby's enormous garden. One on buffet tables garnished with glistening hors d'oeuvre. Spiced baked hams crowded against salads of harlequin designs and pastry pigs, and turkeys bewitched to a dark gold. In the main hall, a bar with a real brass rail was set up and stocked with gins and liquors and with cordials so long forgotten that most of the female guests were too young to know one from each another. By 7 o'clock, the orchestra had arrived. No thin 5-piece affair, but a whole pitiful of oboes and trombones and sax viols and cornets and piccolos and low and high thumb drums and the noise. Somebody, I'm sure, remembers how the Grinch stole Christmas. Whatever. The last swimmers have come in from the beach now and are dressing upstairs. The cars from New York are parked 5 deep in the drive, and already stalls and solids around as are gaudy with primary colors, and hair shorn in the strange new ways.
and shells beyond the dreams of Castile. The bar's full swing and floating rounds of cocktails permeate the garden outside until the air is alive with the chatter and laughter and casual innuendo and introductions far out on the spot and enthusiastic meetings before the women who ever knew each other's names. Innuendo. The lights grow brighter as the earth lurches away from the sun. And now the orchestra is playing yellow cocktail music, and the opera of Maurice's pitches a key higher. Laughter is easier minute by minute. Yeah, I get it. His party is the life of the soul, whatever. Spilled with prodigies, tipped out of the earful word, the group changed more swiftly, swell with each new arrival, dissolve and form in the same breath. Already there are new wanderers, confident girls who sweep here and there among the stouter and more stable, become more for a sharp, joyous moment for the center of the group, and then excited with triumph. Glide on through the sea change of faces and voices and color, under the constantly changing light. Suddenly, one of the gypsies, in trembling opal, seizes a cocktail out of the air, dumps it down for courage, and moving her hand like Frisco dances out all alone on the canvas platform. A momentary hush. The orchestra leader varies his rhythm obligatory for her, and there is a burst of chatter as the erroneous news goes around that she is Gilda Gray's understudy from the Follies. The party has begun. I believe that on the first night I went to Gatsby's house, I was one of the few guests who had actually been invited. People were not invited, they were there. They got into automobiles which bore them out along, and then somehow they ended up at Gatsby's door. Once there, they were introduced by somebody who knew Gatsby, and after that they conducted himself according to the rules of behavior associated with amusement parks. Sometimes they came and went without having met Gatsby at all, come for the simplicity of heart. That was his own ticket admission. I had been actually invited. Wait, he wasn't? A chevalier in a uniform of robin's egg blew across my lawn early that Sunday morning with a directly formal note from his employer. The honor would be entirely Gatsby's, it said, as if I were to attend his little party that night. He had seen me several times and had attended his little party that night. He had seen me several times and intended to call on me late long before, but a peculiar combination of circumstances had prevented it. Such at Gatsby, in a majestic hand, dressed up in white flannels, I went over to his lawn a little after 7 and wandered rather ill at ease among swirls and eddies of people I didn't know. Man, I relate to that. I've been to so many social gatherings, and a lot of them are like, I don't know these people, And a lot of the time, it's like, I don't really care to know about a few of these people that have lives that are like 500% different than mine and just don't matter to me. You know what I'm saying? Oh, okay, whatever. Enough about my life. I was struck by a number of young. I didn't know. People though there, here and there, a face I had noticed on the commuting train. I was immensely struck by the number of young Englishmen dotted about, all well-dressed, all looking a little hungry, and all talking in low, earnest voices. The solid and prosperous Americans, I was sure that they were smiling, selling something, bonds or insurances or automobiles. They were at least agonizingly aware of the easy money in the vicinity, and convinced that it was theirs for a few words in the right key. As soon as I arrived, I made an attempt to find my host, but in the 2 or 3 people of whom I asked his whereabouts stared at me in such an amazed way, and denied so vehemently any knowledge of his movements, that I slunk off in the direction of the cocktail table, the only place in the garden where a single man could linger without looking purposeless and alone. I was on my way to get roaring drunk from sheer embarrassment when Jordan Barker came out on the house and stood at the Holland marble steps, leaning a little backwards and looking with contemptuous interest down in the garden.
Welcome or not, I found it necessary to attach myself to someone before I began to address cordial remarks to the passers-by. "Hello!" I roared, advancing towards her. My voice seemed unnaturally loud across the garden. "I thought you might be here," she responded absently as I came up. "I remember you lived next door to—" She held my hand impersonally as a promise that she'd take care of me in a minute, and gave ear to two girls in twin yellow dresses. She stopped at the foot of the steps. "Hello," they cried together. "Sorry you didn't win." That was for the golf tournament. She had lost in the finals the week before. "Yeah, you don't know who we are?" said one of the girls, "but we met you here about a month ago." "You dyed your hair since then," remarked Joanna. I startled, but the girls had moved casually on, and her remark was arrested her premature moon, produced like the supper, no doubt, out of a couture's basket. With Jordan's slender golden arm resting in mine, we descended from the steps and sauntered about the garden. A tray of cocktails floated as it through the twilight, and we sat down at the table with the two girls in yellow and three men, each one introduced him as Mr. Mumble. "Do you come to these parties often?" inquired Jordan of the girl beside her. "The last one was the one I met you at," answered the girl in alert, confident mind. She turned to her companion. "Wasn't it for you, Lucille?" "It was for Lucille, too. I liked to come. I didn't care." "I never care what I do, so I always have a good time. When I was here last, I tore my gown on a chair. And he asked me my name and address. Inside a week, I got a package from Courtiers with a new evening gown in it." "Did you keep it?" "Sure I did. I was going to wear it tonight, but it was too big in the bust and had to be altered. It was gas blue with lavender beads. $265. Damn, that's like a lot back then. 19... $265. It was like the mid 1925s, right? Okay, rough estimate. Damn, $3,818 for a dress? What? That's freaking absurd. "There's something funny about a fellow that do a thing like that," said the other girl, agreeing eagerly. "He doesn't want any trouble with anybody." "Who doesn't?" I inquired. Gatsby told me. Oh god, I really feel my voice starting to dry out. The Coog girls and Jordan leaned together confidently. Somebody told me that I thought he killed the man once. So the thrill passed over us. The three Mr. Mumbles bent forward and listened eagerly. "I don't think it's so much that. It's more that he was a German spy during the war. One of the men nodded in confirmation. "I heard that from a man who knew all about him. Grew up with him in Germany," he assured us positively. "Oh no," said the first girl. "It could be that, because he was in the American army during the war." As our cardiology switched back to her, as she leaned forward with enthusiasm. "You look at him sometimes when he thinks nobody's looking at him. I bet he killed a man." She nailed in. She nailed her eyes and shivered. Lucille shivered. We all turned and looked around for Gatsby. It was a testimony to the romantic speculation he inspired that there were whispers about him from those who found little that was necessary to whisper around in the world. The first supper, there would be another one after midnight, was now served, and the Jordan invited me to join her own party. Who were spread around a table on the other side of the garden. There were three married couples and Jordan's escort, a persistent undergraduate given to violent innuendo, obviously under the impression that sooner or later Jordan was going to yield him up to her person to a greater or lesser degree. Instead of rambling, this party had preserved the dignity and the homogeneity
and it assumed to itself the function of representing the styid nobility of the countryside. East Egg condescending to West Egg and carefully on guard against its respect. Let's get out, whispered Jordan after somehow wasteful and inappropriate half hour. This is too much. This is much too polite for me. We got up, and she explained that we were going to bed. The host, I had never met him. I had never met him, she said, and it was making me uneasy. The undergraduate nodded in a cynical, melancholy way. The bar where we glanced first was crowded, but Gatsby was not there. She could find him on the top. Of the steps, but he wasn't on the run. Where is Gatsby? It's like where's Waldo, but for whatever this is. She couldn't find him from the tops of the steps, and he wasn't on the veranda. One chance he tried an important looking door and walked to the high Gothic library. Panel with carved English oak and probably transported complete with some ruin overseas. A stout middle-aged man with enormous owl-eyed spectacles was sitting somewhere drunk in the edge of a retail, staring with unsteady concentration into the books. As we entered, he wheeled excitedly around and examined Jordan from head to foot. What do you think? He demanded. About what? About... He waved his hands... About that. He waved his hand towards bookshelves. About what? As a matter of fact, you need bother to ascertain that are real. The books, he said, absolutely real. I have pages and everything. I thought they'd be a nice, durable cardboard. Matter of fact, they're absolutely real. Pages in here. Let me show you. Taking our skepticism for granted, he rushed the bookcases and returned with volume 1 with the Stoddard lectures. See, he cried triumphantly, it's a bona fide piece of printed matter. He had fooled me. This fellow's a regular Belasco. It's a triumph. What thoroughness. What realism. Knew when to stop, too. Didn't cut the pages. What do you want? What do you expect? He snatched the book from me and replaced it hastily on its shelf, muttering that if one brick was removed, the whole library was liable to collapse. Who brought you? He demanded. Or did you just come? I was brought. Most people were brought. Jordan looked at him alertly. Carefully. I was brought by a woman named Roosevelt. Mrs. Claude Roosevelt. Do you know her? I met her somewhere last night. I've been drunk for about a week now. I don't know why, but for some reason the idea of a person being drunk for a whole week is hilarious. I don't know what's wrong with me. And I thought it might sober me up to sit in the library. Has it? A little bit, I think. I can't tell yet. I've only been here an hour. Did I tell you about the books? They're real. Yeah, I get it. You're drunk and you're repeating stuff. You told us. We shook hands with him gravely and went back outdoors. There was dancing now on the caverns in the garden. An old man pushing young girls backward in eternal graces circles. Superior couples holding each other tortuously, fashionably, and keeping in the corners. And a great number of single girls dancing individualistically or relieving the orchestra for a moment of the burden of the banjo or the traps. By midnight, the hilarity had increased. The celebrated tenor had sung in Italian. The notorious Consuelo had sung in jazz, and between the numbers, people were doing stunts all over the garden, while happy, vacuous bursts of laughter rose towards the summer sky. A pair of stage twins, who turned out to be girls in yellow, did a baby act in costume. Champagne was served in glasses bigger than finger bowls. Damn. That's like... I don't even know what I was drawing anymore. The point is that the bowl is really large. The moon had risen higher and rising floating, and the sound was a triangle of silver scales treming a little to the stiff, tiny drip of the banjos on the yarn. I was still with Jordan Baker. We were sitting at the table with a man about my age and a rowdy little girl who came upon the slightest provocation to the uncomfortable laughter. I was enjoyable myself now. I had taken 2 finger bowls of champagne, and the scene had changed before my eyes and something significant, elemental, and profound. At a lull in the entertainment, the man looked at me and smiled. "Your face is familiar," he said politely. "Weren't you the 3rd Division during the war?" "Why, yes, I was in the 9th Machine Gun Battalion. I was in the 7th Infantry until June 1918. Until June 1918. I knew I'd seen you somewhere before." We talked for a moment about some wet gray villages in France. Evidently, he lived in the vicinity, for he told me that he had just brought a hydroplane and was going to try it out in this morning. "Want to go with me, old sport? Just near the shore, along the Sound." "What time?" "Any time that suits you best." It was on the tip of my tongue to ask his name when Jordan looked around and smiled. "Having a gay time, oh now?" I don't know why I said that out loud. She inquired. "Much better." I turned again to my new acquaintance. "This is an unusual party for me. I haven't even seen the host. I lived over there." I waved my hand at the invisible hedge in distance, and the man Gatsby sent over his chauffeur with the invitation. For a moment, he looked at me as if he failed to understand. "I'm Gatsby." Da da da. "What?" I exclaimed. "Oh, I beg your pardon. I thought you were, old sport. I'm afraid I'm not a very good host." He smiled understandingly. Much more than understandingly. It was one of those rare smiles with the quality of eternal reassurance in it that you may come across 4 or 5 times in life. It faced, or seemed to face, seem to face the whole external world for an instant and then concentrate on you with an irresistible prejudice in your favor. It understood you just so far as you wanted to be understood. Believed in you as you would like to believe in yourself. Oh yeah, kids, believe in yourself, and assured you that it had precisely the impression of you that, at your best, you hoped to convey. Precisely at that point, it vanished, and I was looking at an elegant young roughneck, a year or 2 over 30, whose elaborate formality of speech just missed being absurd. Some time before he introduced himself, I got a strong impression that he was picking his words with care. Almost at the moment when Mr. Gatsby identified himself, a butler hurried toward him with the information that Chicago was calling him on the wire. "Chicago!" That advertisement stuck in my head. He accused himself with a small bow that included each of us in turn. "If you want anything, just ask for it, old sport," he urged me. "Excuse me, I will rejoin you later." When he was gone, I turned immediately to Jordan, constrained to share of my surprise. I had expected that Mr. Gatsby would be a florid and corpulent person in his middle 30s. "Who is he?" I demanded. "Do you know? He is just a man named Gatsby. Where is he from? I mean, what does he do?" "Now you're started on this subject," she answered with a wan smile. "Well, he told me once that he was an Oxford man." A dim background started to take shape between him, but at next remark it faded away. "However, I don't believe it." "Why not?" "I don't know," she insisted. "I just don't think he went there. Something in her tone reminded me of the other girls. I think he killed a man and had the effect of stimulating my curiosity. I would have accepted without question the information that Gatsby sprung from the swamp of Louisiana or from the lower east side of New York. That was comprehensible, but young men didn't. At least in my provincial experience, I believe that they didn't. Driftily cooling out of nowhere and built by a palace on Long Island Sound. Anyhow, he gives me large parties," said Jordan, changing the subject with an unbrained distaste for the concrete. "And I like large parties. They're so intimate."
They're so intimate. At small parties, there isn't any privacy. There was a boom of a large bass drum, and the voice of the orchestra leader rang out suddenly above the echolia of the garden. "Ladies and gentlemen," he cried, "at the request of Mr. Gatsby, we are going to play for you Mr. Vladimir Tolstoy's latest work, which attracted so much attention at Carnegie Hall last May." Hey, I want to go to Carnegie College. "If you read the papers, you know there was a big sensation." He smiled a jovial conversation and added, "Some sensation," whereupon everybody laughed. "This piece is known as," he concluded, just thusly, "as Vladimir's Tolstoy Jazz History of the World." You like jazz? The nature of Mr. Tolstoy's composition eluded me, because just as it began, my eyes fell on Gatsby, standing alone on the marble steps and looking from one group to another with brooding eyes. His tanned skin was drawn attractively tight on the face, with his short hair looked as though it was trimmed every day. I could see nothing sinister about him. I wondered if the fact that he was not drinking helped to set him off from his guests, for it seemed to me that he grew more correct as the fraternal hilarity increased. When the jazz history of the world was over, girls were putting their hat on men's shoulders in a puppyish, conventional way. Girls were swooning backwards, playfully, into men's arms, even into groups, knowing that someone would arrest their falls, but no one swooned backwards on Gatsby. And on French Bob touched Gatsby's shoulder, and no singing quartets were formed from Gatsby's head for one link. "I beg your pardon." Gatsby's butler was suddenly standing beside us. "Miss Baker," he inquired, "I beg your pardon, but Mr. Gatsby would like to speak to you alone." "With me?" she screamed in surprise. "Yes, madam." She got up slowly, raising her eyes above me in astonishment, and followed the butler towards the house. I noticed that she wore her evening dress, all her dresses like sports clothes. There was a jauntiness about her movements, as if she had first learned to walk upon golf courses on clean, crisp mornings. I was alone, and it was almost 2. For some time, confused and intriguing sounds had issued from a long, many-windowed room which overhung the terraces, eluding Jordan's undergraduate, who was now engaged in an hysterical conversation with 2 chorus girls, and who implored me to join him. I went inside. The large room was full of people. One of the girls in yellow was playing the piano, and beside her stood a tall, red-haired young lady from a famous chorus, engaged in song. She had drunk a quantity of champagne, and during the course of her song she had decidedly, ineptly, that everything was very, very sad. She was not only singing, she was weeping too. Whenever there was a pause in song, she filled it with gasping, broken sobs, and then took up the lyric again in a quavering soprano. The tears coursed through her cheeks, not freely, however, for when she came into contact with her heavily beaded eyelashes, they assumed an inky color, and pursued the rest of their way in slow back rudels. And a humorous suggestion was made that she sing the notes on her face. Whereupon she threw up her hands, sank into the chair, and went off into a deep sleep. She had a flight with a man who says she's her husband. Explained to Girl Mabel. I looked around. Most of the remaining women were now having fights with men said to be their husband. Even Jordan's party, the quartet from Eastek, were rest asunder by disunder. One of the men was attempting to, with curious intensity, to a young actress and his wife. After attempting to left the situation and take it by a different way, broke down entirely and resorted to flank attacks. At intervals, she appeared suddenly at his side like an angry diamond hissed, "You promised," into his ear. The reluctance to go home was not confined to wayward men. The hall was at present occupied by 2 deliberately sober men and their highly indignant wives. The wives sympathized with each other in slightly raised voices. "Whenever he sees I'm having a good time, he wants to go home. Never heard anything so selfish in my life. We're always the first ones to leave. So are we. Well, we're almost the last tonight." Said one of the men sheepishly. "The orchestra left half an hour ago. In spite of the wives' agreements that such malevolence was beyond credibility, the dispute ended in a short struggle, and both wives were left
lifted, kicking into the night. As I waited for my hat in the hall, the door of the library opened. Jordan Baker and Gatsby came out together. He was saying some last words to her. But the eagerness in his manner tightened. Okay, I just want to check that. He was saying some last. But he sang some last words to her, but the innocent man tightened sharply into formality, so people approached him to say goodbye. Jordan's party was calling promptly to her porch, but she lingered for a moment to shake hands. I've just heard the most amazing thing, she whispered. How long were we in there? Why, about an hour. It was simply amazing, she repeated abstractly, but I swore I couldn't tell it, and here I am tantalizing you. She yawned gracefully in my face. Please come and see me. Phone book under the name of Mrs. Sigourney Howard, my aunt. She was hurrying off as she talked. Her brown hand waved a jaunty salute as she melted into their party at the door. Rather assumed that on my first appearance I had stayed so late. I joined the last of Gatsby since we were clustered around him. I wanted to explain that I hunted for him eagerly in the evening, had to apologize for not having known him in the garden. Don't mention he enjoyed me eagerly. Don't give it another thought, old sport. The familiar expression held no more familiarity than the hand which assuredly brushed my shoulder. And don't forget we're going up in the hydroplane tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Red the butter behind his shoulder. Philadelphia wants you on the phone, sir. All right, Inman. Tell him I'll be right there. Good night. 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 He smiled, and suddenly there seemed to be a pleasant significance in having been among the last to go, as if he had desired it all the time. Good night, old sport. Good night. But as I walked down the steps, I saw that the evening was not quite over. 50 feet from the door, a dozen headlights illuminated a bizarre and tumultuous scene. In the ditch beside the road, right beside them, but violently showing up one wheel, rested a new coupe, which had left Gatsby's drive not 2 minutes ago. The sharp just out of wall accounted for the attachment of the wheel, which was now getting considerable attention from half a dozen courteous chauffeurs. However, as they had left their car blocking the road, a harsh discordant din from there in the rear had been time to add to the already violent confusion. A man in a long duster dismounted from the wreck and now stood in the middle of the road, looking for the car to turn from the door to the observers in a pleasant, puzzled way. See, explained, it went into the dish. The fact was infinitely astonishing, and I recognized first the unusual quality of wonder, and then the man. It was the late patron of Gatsby's library. How did it happen? He shrugged his shoulders. I know nothing about whatever about mechanics, he said decisively, but how did it happen? Did you run into the wall? Don't ask me, said Alwise, washing his hands and holding. I know very little about train, next to nothing. It happened, and that's all I know. Well, if you're a poor driver, you'd ought to try driving at night. But I wasn't even trying, he explained indignantly. I wasn't even trying. An odd hush fell upon the bicycle. Do you want to commit suicide? You're lucky it was just a wheel. A bad driver not even trying. You don't understand, explained the criminal. I wasn't driving. There's another man in the car. Shocked that fault because she found its voice in a sustained as the door of coupe swung into the crowd. It was not a crowd. Stepped back involuntarily when the door had opened. There was a ghostly pause. Then, very gradually, part by part, a pale, dangling individual stepped out of the wreck, pawing tentatively at the ground with its large, uncertain, dancing toe, blinded by the glare of headlights and confused by the instant groaning of the horns. The apparition stood, swaying for the moment before he pursued the man in duster. What's the matter? He inquired calmly. Did we run out of gas? Look! Half a dozen pointing fingers looked at the amputated wheel. He stared at it more and then looked forward at though he suspected that it had dropped from the sky. It came off, someone explained. He nodded. At first I didn't notice. He stopped. A pause. Then, taking a long breath and shrugging his shoulders, he remarked in a determined voice, "What if you tell me if there was a gas line station? At least a dozen men, some of them a little better off than he was," explained to him that the wheel and car was no longer joined by any physical bond. Back out, he said after a minute. Put her in reverse. But the wheel's up, he hesitated. No harm in trying. The Cotterwell horn had... Oh my god. When is this over? Okay. Home stretch. The caterwauling horns had reached a crescendo, and I turned away and cut the lawn toward home. I glanced back once. A wafer of the moon was shining over Gatsby's house, making the night fine as before, and surviving the laughter and the sound of his still growing car. Then, a sudden emptiness seemed to flow now from the windows and the great doors, endowing with complete isolation the figure of the host, who stood on the porch, his hand up in full gesture of farewell. Reading over what I had written so far, I see I had given the impression that the events of 3 nights several weeks ago were all that absorbed me. On the contrary, they were merely casual events in a crowded summer, and until much later, they absorbed me infinitely less than my personal affairs. Most of the time I worked in the early morning. The sun threw my shadow westward as I hurried down the white chasms of lower New York to the Probity Trust. I knew the other clerks and young bond salesmen by their first names, and lunched with them in the crowded restaurants on Little Pig sausages and mashed potatoes and coffee. I even had a short affair with a girl who lived in Jersey City and worked in the accounting department, but her brother began throwing means, looking me in my direction, so when she came on direction in July, I let it blow quickly lame. I took dinner usually at the Yale Club. For some reason, it was the gloomiest event of my day. And then I went upstairs to the library and studied investments and securities for the conscientious hour. There were generally a few rioters all around, but they never came into the library, so it was a good place to work. After that, if the night was mellow, I strolled down Madison Avenue past the old Murray Hill Hotel and over 33rd Street to the Pennsylvania Station. I began to like New York. What time is it? The racy feeling, adventurous feeling of it all night, and the fast fashion that the constant flicker of men and women and machines gives to the restless eyes. I like to walk up Fifth Avenue and pick out romantic women from the crowd and imagine that in a few moments I was going to enter into my lives and no one would ever know or disapprove. Sometimes in my mind I followed them to their apartments on the corners of Hinge Streets, and they turned and smiled back to me before they faded through a door into warm darkness. At the enchanted metropolitan night twilight, I felt a haunting loneliness sometimes and felt in others. Poor young clerks who loitered in front of the windows, waiting until it was time for solitary restaurant dinner. Young clerks in the dusk, wasting the most poignant moments of the night in life. Again at 8 o'clock, when the dark lanes of the 40s were 5 deep with throbbing taxicabs bound for the theater district, I felt a smirk sinking in my heart. Forms leaned together in the taxis as they waited, and voices sang, and there was laughter from unheard jokes, and lighted cigarettes outlined unintelligible 70 gestures inside. Imagine that I, too, was hurrying toward the gathering and sharing that intimate excitement. I wished them well. For a while I lost sight of Jordan Baker, and then in midsummer I found her again. At first I was flattened to go places with her because she was a golf champion, and everyone knew her name. Then it was something more. I wasn't actually in love, but I felt a sort of tender curiosity. The bored, haughty face that she turned to the world concealed something most affectations conceal something eventually, even though they don't in the beginning. And one day I found what it was. When we were on the house party together in Warwick, she left a borrowed car out in the rain with the top down, and then lied about it. And suddenly I remembered the story about her that had eluded me the night at Daisy's. At her big golf tournament, there was a row that nearly reached the newspapers. A suggestion that she had moved her ball from a bad lie. Newspapers, a suggestion that a bad lie in the semi-final round. The thing approached the proportions of a scandal and died away. A caddy retracted his statement, and the only other witness admitted that he might have been mistaken. The incident and the name had remained together in my mind. Jordan Baker instinctively avoided clever, shrewd men, and now I was that this was because she felt safer on a plane where any divergence from a code would be thought impossible. She was incurably dishonest. She wasn't able to endure being at a disadvantage, and given this unwillingness, I suppose she had begun dealing as subterfuges when she was very young in order to keep that cool, insolent smile turned to the world and satisfy the man. Hard, yes, jaunty body. It made no difference to me. Dishonesty in a woman is a thing you never blame deeply. I was casually sorry, and then I forgot. It was on the same house party that we had a curious conversation about driving a car. It started because she passed so close to some workman that our fender flicked a button on one man's coat. "You're a rotten driver," I protested. "Either you ought to be more careful or you ought to drive at all." "I am careful." "No, you're not." "Well, other people are," she said lightly. "Well, what's that got to do with it?" "Still, keep out of my way," she insisted. "It takes two to make an accident. Suppose you met somebody just as careless as so." "I probably never will," she answered. "I hate careless. That's why I like you." Her gray, sun-strained eyes stared ahead, but she had deliberately shifted our relations, and for a moment I thought I loved her. But I'm slow thinking, and I'm full of interior rules that act as brakes on my desires, and I knew that first I had to get myself definitely out of that tangled back room. I'd been writing Lancers once a week and signing them. "Love, Nick." And all I could think of was how, when that certain girl played tennis, a faint mustache of perspiration appeared on her upper lip. Nevertheless, there was a vague understanding that had to be tactfully broken off before it was free. Everyone suspects himself of at least one of these cardinal virtues, and this is mine. I am one of the few honest people that I've ever known. Okay. I think that was enough. All right. That was more than a third of the words. I think I'm good. And I read 3 chapters. Oh boy, that was a long one. Okay, that was Gatsby. 1/3 of the chapters. 1/3. 1/3. I think that's good for now. I'm gonna go freaking strangle my neck and possibly end my life or something. Okay, well, I'm very healthy right now. Okay, bye people on the internet.